Welcome to episode 121 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today we get to speak to retired agent John Mindermann, who served in the FBI for 20 years. During his career, he was a firearms and defensive tactics instructor and the leader of the 1st Washington Field Office SWAT team. In this episode, he reviews his assignment on C2, the Miscellaneous Crimes Squad assigned to the Watergate investigation. He reveals little-known facts about the case, including the circumstances leading to the interview of a key witness and the FBI shutdown of the presidential business offices in the White House. Later in his career, John Mindermann was assigned to the Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, where he specialized in violence avoidance and created and taught crisis intervention and police stress programs. Prior to retiring, he returned back to his hometown, San Francisco, where he supervised an organized crime and narcotics squad. John Mindermann is the author of In Pursuit: From the Streets of San Francisco to Watergate, a gripping tale of a defining moment in American history, the Watergate scandal. Now, this is the second time that I have reviewed the Watergate investigation. As many of you may recall, in episode 63, I spoke to Angelo Lano, who was the case agent of the Watergate investigation. And I'm proud to say that I had the opportunity to meet Angelo last week at the barbecue hosted by the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI Philadelphia chapter. Angelo, however, did not write a book about his experiences, but with his blessing, John Mindermann did. So if you want a chronological look at the case, please make sure you listen to episode 63. What John Mindermann gives us is a behind-the-scenes color commentary that I think you're going to really enjoy. My conversation with John Mindermann morphed into a discussion of the public's perception of the FBI today that I think is also very important for you to hear, especially now that the IG's report on the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation is out. I respect and accept the findings of that report. Those text messages, WTF. I continue to be angry and frustrated that FBI employees would discuss politics, especially at such a negative and derogatory way, while at work. We all have the right to our opinions, but at no time during my FBI career do I remember any discussion of politics while on the job. As noted in a newspaper article by the Associated Press on this matter, those text messages exchanged by FBI employees who worked on the investigation have cast a cloud over the FBI's handling of the probe and has damaged its reputation. I am definitely relieved that the IG's report concludes that the Clinton investigation, although plagued by leadership missteps, was not tainted by political bias. But before we get to the interview, I just want to remind you that my new crime novel, Greedy Givers, will be out on June 28th. The feedback I've been receiving from my advanced reader team has been spectacular. If you like character-driven redemption plot stories, Greedy Givers, a police procedural about an FBI agent investigating the man behind a multi-million-dollar charity Ponzi scheme, is for you. I'll tell you more about Greedy Givers at the end of the interview. One last thing, I want to invite you to join my reader team where once a month I email a digest of the previous month's podcast episodes. my crime fiction recommendations, and keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you'll get the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by some of the FBI agents who have been featured on this podcast. John Mindermann's book, In Pursuit, is there, as well as my book, Pay to Play, and soon to be Greedy Givers, and more than 35 other books. To join my reader team, all you need to do is go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up. And if you want to support the show, in addition to joining my reader team, you can also pick up a copy of one of my books and, of course, subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app. Now here's the show.
I am absolutely thrilled to be interviewing today John Mindermann. Hi, John. How are you?
Real good, Jerry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Now, I had already interviewed retired agent Angelo Lano about Watergate. And then I found your book, and I discovered that it's the only book written by FBI personnel about Watergate, which is amazing to me because it's such an important part of the FBI's history.
Exactly right, Jerry. It was the reason that I did write the book. What had happened is, prior to me getting involved in doing the research and writing the book, I had given a few little lectures around the Bay Area about the FBI and specifically about Watergate to groups of as many as 300. And these lectures and efforts about Watergate had really, really intrigued people. And people would say, hey, you really need to write a book about that. So I was aware that none of the agents involved in the Watergate case had written a book about it. And I thought this was a real void that needed to be filled in FBI lore and FBI history, because the only story out there about Watergate was the Woodward and Bernstein All the President's Men Washington Post story, and, of course, the very successful 1976 movie that followed from that. And while that's a great story, and it is their story, it's not the FBI story. So that's why I wrote the book.
Well, I've had a chance to read your book, and let me backtrack. Let me say it this way, that Angelo Lano, and you can tell us, where you were as far as your role in the investigation. He was the case agent. And when I interviewed him on this podcast, it was a fascinating interview. He's like, the by-the-books bureau personality. But I think you've got some really great stories that no one's ever heard about. And so I thought, I've done the interview, I've done the case review before, but not in this way, not with these, really interesting, fascinating stories. So I think what I'm trying to say is that Angelo Lano gave us the case history, but what I'm hoping that we'll get from you today is like the color commentary.
I hope to be able to do that, and I think I might be qualified because I was one of the many agents who worked the case, so I fell into a pool of agents who were very close to Angelo and actually handled the leads and handled the work that needed to be done. So what came to me and what I tried to develop with other agents, exactly like FBI agents do everywhere, is I tried to do the work assigned to me, but at the same time take whatever I got and make it a force multiplier to help the overall effort of all our agents.
The name of your book is In Pursuit, From the Streets of San Francisco to Watergate. John, do you mind reading the dedication that you wrote?
Not at all.
And this is the dedication you wrote to the case agent for the Watergate case, Angelo Lano.
I'll be glad to read it. And it reads as follows: to Special Agent Angelo Lano, who displayed determined, even confrontational courage leading our C2 squad and generously shared his insightful new revelations. With his contagious fervor and resolute, unflinching character, he brilliantly choreographed and orchestrated an ever-evolving game plan, which triumphed in the midnight dark moments against powerful, entrenched forces and threats to the American way. And I put the American way in quotes because, to me, that's what we were doing as FBI agents. We were always trying to perpetuate, enhance, and protect the finest aspects of something we all knew was the American way. And I wrote those words about Angelo after much, much thought and a lot of notes that I made. I was trying to capture everything that he did and everything that he brought to the case. And I concluded that without him, the case would not have gone forward in the manner and to whatever degree of success we achieved would not have happened without him. I thought he was that special an individual and character.
And so that was your primary role. The squad was C2.
Criminal number 2.
Everybody on the squad, because this was a major case, had a role to play. So tell me more about what role you played in the investigation as compared to Angelo Lano as the case agent.
Yeah, mine was quite a bit differently. I was called in the first day of the investigation, which was June 17th, and as a matter of fact, I was the duty agent. I was the one on call for that whole weekend, but of course Angelo got the call, and most appropriately so, because he had done a lot of cases involving bombings and very, very complex, intricate things. So he would be the logical go-to guy for something like this breaking as it did in the early morning hours of June 17th. So I was called in at actually at 3:40 p.m. in the afternoon, and I remember it quite distinctly because it was a clerk from the Washington field office, and he interrupted my afternoon shower. So I was not a happy guy when I got out dripping wet to take that phone call, and I said, hey, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of my shower. And he goes, no, you can't call me back. So he started by telling me about the case and the information that they had to that point, which was actually reasonably complete. They knew who the burglars were. They knew that a majority of the burglars, I believe 3 of them, were actually Cuban nationals from the Miami area. They knew that one of them, McCord, was an ex-CIA, FBI agent or employee. And they also had another name which had come up from a piece of an envelope or a check found in a dresser named E. Howard Hunt, who was identified through the very quick work of the agents who had been working all day. And the supervisor, John Rule, had been identified as a CIA manager, heavily involved, I believe, in the Bay of Pigs things down in the Miami area, launched against the Cuban government, Castro. So as soon as he told me these names and their backgrounds, I immediately felt this kind of real concern and almost a cold chill coming over me. And then he tells me that I'm to pick up another agent, Mike King, and go to the detective headquarters of Metropolitan Police and look at and actually kind of evaluate money seized by the agents and police officers who were searching the hotel rooms of where these guys stayed before the burglary. And it was $3,400 in brand new $100 bills with consecutive serial numbers. And when I actually observed this with the other agent, Mike King, at the detective headquarters in the Metropolitan Police, with about 3 or 4 detectives sitting around there and kind of chortling and marveling at this highly unusual situation, I had, prior to coming to the FBI, I had a lot of experience as a police officer, so I had handled hundreds of burglaries of every kind and stripe. And I had never had a burglary where the individuals we took into custody, the burglars themselves, had 34 $100 bills in their possession. or in their room when we searched the room, brand new with consecutive serial numbers. So this really stood out with the additional information I had about the suspects or the subject's background, and I knew from the get-go that this was going to be a substantial case, a huge case. I didn't know what the implications were going to be, but I knew it was no ordinary burglary, as did the detectives who were on duty that day. In fact, they made a big deal out of spreading this money on a desk. It was in glass-seed envelopes, and they had gloves on, and it was quite a scene. They made it very, very dramatic. That was the start of the case for me.
So in today's money, because this happened in 1972, in today's dollars, how much would that be?
I think it's about $20,000, between $20,000 and $25,000. So it's a lot of money. That's just not an insignificant amount of money. So this meant that this burglary, this team, was extremely well funded and backed. So we had a tremendous amount of information that very, very first day. By the time we came up to 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock when I got involved in the case, and this only, of course, added to it.
Where did this money come from?
Well, the money, as it turned out, I only did the initial investigation that day concerning the money. As was kind of the way the case evolved over the months, Angelo was a very, very hands-on, highly active case agent. He was a manager, and he was also an investigator. And Angelo had a lot of contacts with the Secret Service and with other organizations. So Angelo, I believe, actually kind of jumped in and ran the money trail from that point in. I didn't have anything to do with the money trail from that point in. I did hear and I did get information about, well, it went to the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, then it came back to Miami, then it went to Omaha, and then it was down into Texas. And then about a week in, I know we ran into a major, major roadblock in that the money had been traced to Mexico City, and that we were waiting for Bureau approval to send the lead to have the LEGAD covered in Mexico City. And the Bureau approval was not coming back. And I can remember Angelo pacing back and forth in the office and being very, very distressed, very adamant, and very determined to have this lead covered. And he did something highly unusual. Angelo was a relief supervisor, and he shared with me that he actually went down, and when the SAC at the time, Robert Kunkel, refused to sign the request out to, further drive headquarters to give us the okay, Leno grabbed the communication from Kunkel's hands and he said, watch this. And he signed Robert Kunkel's initials and, of course, drew a line and put his initials underneath, and he sent the missive out himself. And the result of that, of course, was he eventually was summoned to headquarters, he shared with me, and he was kind of read out by L. Patrick Gray, I believe, for, taking this kind of action. But it's a good example of the kind of leadership that he was willing to exhibit to get the job done, and it was this kind of determination that he had. In fact, we really all had this kind of determination because there was another event that happened I want to talk a little bit about, and I term it the Saturday morning massacre, but that's a separate and apart from what I'm talking about here.
Oh, well, you can't tease us like that. But before you, I know what you're talking about because I read the book, but before we get into that, you were hinting there of hesitation on the part of leadership in the FBI to really aggressively move forward with this case. And I think we need to hear, or get an explanation as to what was going on at the time.
Well, it was a very, very tumultuous time in the country. I think we recall the protests and the end of the Vietnam War, and there were massive demonstrations in Washington, D.C., which we were confronting and had dealt with prior to the Watergate. And, of course, going back to 1968 when I was in training school in Washington, D.C., you had riots on April 4th and April 5th following the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee. So this atmosphere of tumultuous activity, crowd activity, protest, everything was ongoing. So we were dealing with that in amongst all the other stuff we had. But coming back to the Watergate here and leadership in this particular case, I mentioned Angelo's role, but there's also the role of the individual agents such as myself and many, many others who were carrying the load of covering the leads. We were quite determined to see this through to the end. So the leadership seemed to be spread amongst the agents and the determination to come together very much like kind of a really high-functioning, successful sports team that's achieving victory after victory and game after game. We were doing this as we faced different stepping stones in the investigation as it moved along. So I felt as though I had a lot of support from my fellow agents. I knew I had it from Angelo, but also from the guys that I was working with. We would come together on this squad, and I have to mention the name of the squad. It was Criminal Number 2, but our title was Miscellaneous Crimes. And that's really, we were kind of the sweepers of the criminal side of the Washington field office.
There's a little bit of everything, it sounds like.
Oh, literally. We were spread all over the map. So the character of the squad was such that we were almost like independent contractors working our individual caseloads. But then when we had need to come together, we did that very, very quickly, and we were very supportive of one another. So we had cohesion, and we had kind of a group effort when we needed it. But we also were very able to work independently of one another because of the nature of our day-to-day work.
Well, I have to remark that you're talking about, operating like a sports team, all the players together. But, sports teams have owners, and they have managers, and they have coaches. And it doesn't sound like you got that same type of support from FBI leadership. So
we did. Yeah, we really did not. There was no feeling that we had a high level of support or that there was a lot of direction from headquarters. I felt, and from what I could see, it looked like, they were engaged. They must have been having conversations, but it didn't seem to be the case that any one individual was really marshaling whatever they had been talking about or whatever they had decided and really putting forth a clear message and clear direction for everybody to be moving. And I think that had to do a lot with the fact that this case broke on June 17th and that J. Edgar Hoover had died 44 days prior on May 2nd. That was a huge loss for the FBI because Hoover, being such a dominant character for so long, left really a tremendous void in his wake. And I think we were really feeling that when this case came along.
Well, can I make an observation? Of course, I wasn't with the FBI at that time. I didn't join the FBI until 1982. But from what I've learned and read and heard, that Hoover was such a leader that he made so many decisions that everyone around him was afraid to make decisions. They didn't know how to make decisions, and they knew that if they took the chance to decide on something and they were wrong, that they could jeopardize their job. So it sounds like once he died, there were all these so-called FBI leaders who did not know how to lead.
That's absolutely the case. You very succinctly laid out, I think, what exactly the problem was. And there were many, many stories that we would hear when we were drinking coffee in the morning with men from FBI headquarters about what had been going on. in the late 60s and the early 70s, some of them quite funny in the problems that were faced and the way they were overcome in dealing with J. Edgar Hoover. Some of them really not very funny at all, but it did point to this whole area of dominant, singular, almost obsessive control to the detriment of developing leadership underneath you to support your direction as the head of the organization, and perhaps even to have people prepared to fill in when you were absent or when, in this case, actually died May 2nd. So we're left with this huge hole, and there's no leadership, and we're on our own. So we're reacting to what's in front of us, and we're reacting to what really Angelo's dealing with. So that's the way we move forward.
Now, if you could bring everybody up to speed, because there are going to be some listening to this who don't know who took over once Director Hoover died. So why don't you explain that issue? And it was a major issue because there were people who had worked for Hoover who had hoped that they would become director.
There was one character who was a dominant part of the hierarchy of the FBI, and that was Mark Felt. And I was very much aware of Felt because when I was in my first office in Dallas, Texas, there had been an incident involving an SAC in Oklahoma City to our north, and we were conversant with some difficulties that had happened up there, and Felt had handled that, and it was an absolute disaster for the individual SAC. He wound up being, according to the information we had, fired and actually sent out of the FBI without a pension or anything, and several agents were disciplined, and that was all at the hands of Mark Felt, who at that time had a reputation of being just a really hard disciplinarian, Hoover's right-hand man, to ensure that the agents stayed in line, a la the Hoover mentality, I guess is the best way to put it. So Felt had this very, very strong reputation, and there were others, specific names of whom I'm not aware, but there was that general atmosphere of fear rather than kind of a healthy leadership style in the underlings beneath Hoover. So these are the men who took over, so to speak, and were supposed to be driving it, but they really didn't have the experience as we noted. It was a confusing situation, and the individual who eventually stepped in there was L. Patrick Gray, who was not an FBI agent at all.
And I understand that there was a lot of resentment and mistrust for this new acting director. Who was he? Where did he come from? Where were his loyalties?
Exactly, yeah. We knew that he had come out of the Navy, that he was a Navy captain. In the way of handling the case as we were underway, we actually had an incident that occurred where all of us who were working the Watergate case actually were summoned to Gray's office on a Saturday morning and really, really put through the ringer by him personally. So we came to meet him on a face-to-face basis very quickly as we worked this case.
And that's that Saturday morning massacre you're talking about. Could you give us some details? Because I mean, in the book, what happened that day was just totally unprofessional, and it had to be humiliating for the agents, working on the Watergate case. So tell us what led up to L. Patrick Gray calling you into his office that morning.
Yeah, what actually happened there? We're working the case, and there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of frustration. I mentioned Angelo Leno dealing with the difficulty of covering the lead in Mexico City on the money trail, but there were other things happening, and the pressure was building. Stuff was leaking out into the media, and all of us working the case received a call late in the evening, about 7:30 or 8 o'clock on a Friday night, about 2 weeks into the case, and we were told to be in the Washington field office Saturday morning at about 8:30, no later than 8:45, and we were to be on our best blue suit, white shirt, shine shoes. We were to be real spiffy, and we were to get ready. We're going to go down and meet the new director. That's all we were told. So we report the next morning in the outfit that I described, and we're talking to one another as we walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. You can imagine this bizarre scene. Here are about 24 FBI agents walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. Nobody else is out there on a Saturday morning from 12th and Pennsylvania down to the old FBI headquarters. And they're all dressed the same way. And they look like Mormon missionaries. And we're walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. And as we enter, Charlie Bates, the assistant director for the criminal division, was actually checking our names off on a roster as we came in. And when he came to my name, he said, "Oh, you're from San Francisco." And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "Well, yeah, I was the SAC out there." And I thought, well, how did he know that? Well, he probably knew that because he went through my personnel file, and he probably went through the files of everybody else in preparation for this. And it was very apparent there then that this was probably not going to be a meeting where we're going to be commended by the director. So what occurred was all of us, there were 27 of us, including the SAC, the ASAC, and the supervisor, John Rule. Then there were the balance of the working agents, Angelo Leno, myself, and the others. There were 27 of us around this big oval table awaiting the entrance of L. Patrick Gray after going through this name check procedure. Gray walks in. All eyes go to Gray. He's crew cut. His face is almost crimson. He looks like he's about ready to explode before he says a thing. He approaches the rostrum, and he looks out over the group. He's got a firm grip on the rostrum, and he proceeds to slowly explode. And he launches into a tirade accusing the group of agents of leaking information to Sandy Smith of Time magazine. None of us knew who Sandy Smith was, could care less. We're just working a case, but he was convinced that one of us in this group had leaked information to Sandy Smith. And at the end of a tirade, an accusation-filled tirade, where he assumed it was one of us, he demanded that the agent or agents who leaked the information step forward. Well, nobody moved. And he became more adamant and more excited. He was moving back and forth, almost jumping up and down, holding onto the rostrum, yelling, "I was a naval captain. I'm a graduate of Annapolis. I commanded a nuclear submarine. I graduated from Georgetown University Law School. You will not fool me. I know how to conduct an investigation. I'm demanding." He did it a second time. Nobody stepped forward, whereupon our SAC, Mr. Kunkel, tentatively took one or two steps forward, I presume to defend us. Gray immediately glared at him and yelled, "Mr. Kunkel, are you the individual who leaked the information?" And Kunkel replied, "No, sir, I'm not." Gray then yells at Kunkel, "Then take 2 steps back." So Kunkel takes 2 steps back, and he's in alignment with the rest of the agents. And Gray goes further on to his tirade, yelling at Charlie Bates, the assistant director. He says, "Mr. Bates, do you have the name of every man in this room?" And Bates says, "Yes, sir, I do." He said, "Make sure you have the name. And I'm telling you, men, if any of you ever come before me again, I will fire you." And then he screams,
Wow.
Then he screams, "Dismissed." And I'm thinking, my God, he thinks we're a Navy crew, okay? He thinks we're on a ship and he's commanding his crew. And with that, he does an about-face and he marches out. And Bates is standing there with this clipboard with our names on it, and he's looking very embarrassed and very chagrined. And we're just, Jerry, we're just kind of we don't know where we are, and we just kind of file out. We're now marching back up Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're muttering to one another, and I have never felt such anger and such disappointment. But what came through in that 3-block walk back to our field office was there was a resoluteness building among us, and we had been dedicated before, but this put us absolutely over the top. So it was a real morale builder as much as anything.
And where was this coming from for L. Patrick Gray? Was he receiving this from the top? Because we haven't even mentioned the name of President Richard Nixon. Nixon
is in the background right now. The people who are really in the line of sight are, of course, the burglary team, including E. Howard Hunt, the CIA manager. There's the White House itself in general, and there's this entity that we're targeting called CREEP, which is the Committee to Re-elect the President, which is a functionary arm funded by the President's political apparatus, and this arm, 72 being an election year, this Committee to Re-elect the President literally was across the street from the White House and operated jointly with the White House. And so we were targeting those two entities, the White House staff and the Committee to Re-elect the President, to develop information on where this money came from to fund the burglary, the $3,400.
So at this point, the connection directly to Nixon, there was nothing there. You know, it was assumed basically that maybe his re-election committee had done something, but certainly he didn't know anything about it and he wasn't involved.
Yeah, at this point, that's where our mindset was, that really it's hard to imagine the president himself knowing anything about this. But immediately beneath the president, his high-level underlings who are his advisors in the White House and who had connections directly with the people in the Committee to Re-elect the President, one or two of whom had come from this general milieu of the president's immediate advisors in the White House, would be involved. So we're operating under the premise that there's a fairly high level underneath the president that knows about, has possibly funded, has directed this single burglary that we're now investigating. That's really all we know at this point. But there's an awful lot of information indicating that, of course, this was a substantial burglary. There's a couple things I kind of want to fill in here, if I could, to step back just a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. One of the things I'd like to do is kind of put into context a couple of things that happened on the night of the burglary. When I did my research for the book, and when I did my participation in investigating the case, certain things came to light that really intrigued me about the happenstance things that occur in any case, in any major happening, that if it had turned one way or the other, the overall event, in this case the Watergate burglary, the overall event would have never been a major investigation by the FBI resulting in the president stepping down, would never have been what it turned out to be. And there were a couple of things that happened in the Watergate case. The first one being, of course, the whole case turned on a low-level security guard in-house at the Watergate facility finding a taped door. The taped door, of course, tuned him in to the fact that something was amiss. So he removed the tape from the door, and when he came back on his rounds about a half an hour, 40 minutes later, the door had been retaped. So he knew at that point something is severely amiss here, and he talked to one of his cohorts, and they said, you really need to call the police, okay? So If it had not been for the security guard finding the tape and eventually concluding, hey, I need to call the cops, nothing would have happened. The burglary would not have been discovered. When the call went out for the police to respond to this suspicious occurrence of the tape, the initial assignment went to a police car, a uniformed police car with uniformed officers. That car was en route to handle the call. If that car had actually showed up, that is, the marked radio car with the uniformed officers, perhaps the lookouts would have seen the police and would have been able to notify the burglars who were caught within the Democratic National Headquarters by the police, and the burglary would have never occurred. They would have seen the marked radio car. But what happened to that car was, en route, I found out from two different sources that particular radio car ran out of gas.
No.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I have never heard this story before.
No.
I read it in your book, but
yes, that's exactly right. I found out from two different sources that because I could, as a former policeman, I could never figure out exactly why there wasn't a marked patrol car. Because the procedure would be you send a radio car. You don't send undercover detectives to investigate a routine burglary. This is a suspicious occurrence, not even a burglary at this point because it's merely tape on a door. So you send a radio car. Well, I found out later when I was checking and talking to people, yeah, the car was en route, but the officers come over there and they go, Unit XYZ to headquarters. Go ahead, XYZ. Well, their words were, we've had a mechanical breakdown. Okay? Great phrase. We've had a mechanical breakdown. Headquarters comes back, communications comes back and says, well, what's the nature of the breakdown? There's a hesitation on the tape, and then the officers come back and say, we ran out of gas.
Oh, my.
It isn't a while. So the cops run out of gas, and they're scrambling now to cover this routine call of a suspicious occurrence. And they find they've got these 3 or 4 officers who are on stakeout close by, and they send down these undercover officers who are dressed down, and they are not in police gear, and they make it all the way into the headquarters, and they catch the burglars within the Democratic National Headquarters with the illegal listening device eventually found in the bottom of the duffel bag, as Angelo describes, wrapped in toilet paper. My point in this is, of course, none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for the tape, if it hadn't been for the cops running out of gas. It goes on and on. There are all these little things that occur that really bring the case to where we got it.
That's fascinating because I don't think, again, until I read about this in your book, I don't think I ever heard of that before. So we know for a fact there was a lookout who was supposed to be warning the burglars, if the police arrived. And according to the lookout, the police never arrived because they didn't see a marked vehicle or uniformed officers. Fascinating.
Correct. Absolutely correct. So if that marked radio car hadn't run out of gas, and Alfred Baldwin, the ex-FBI agent who was the lookout across the street in the Howard Johnson, he certainly would have seen the marked car, I presume, and would have radioed across, and these guys would have gotten out of the Democratic National Headquarters. They would have immediately dumped their burglary tools. They would have dumped all the evidence they had in the hallway or in the stairwell. And the most the cops would have got, the 2 patrol officers, if they caught anybody, would have been somebody away from the Democratic National Headquarters without direct evidence in their possession in the place being burglarized. So it was a huge happenstance that the marked radio car ran out of gas, and that these undercover officers, who are going to be far more, I think the word would be experienced and maybe more astute in handling a situation than line-level patrol officers. So this better-equipped crew responds and makes an amazingly good arrest, valid arrest, within the premises with the evidence in possession of these burglars. So the work that the Metropolitan Police did in setting this case up for the FBI to take over was amazingly good.
You can say that again. Anyone listening to this episode should first listen to Angelo Lano's episode, which is episode 63. But for those people who haven't done that yet or listened to it a while back, could you give us like a 2 or 3 sentence summary of why these individuals were in this office? Tell us who they were and what they were in there. Just a real quick summary.
Yeah, these individuals were operatives of the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon as President of the United States in 1972. And they were 3 Cuban nationals, and they were also, Mr. McCord was a former FBI, either employee or agent, I'm not sure which, and a former CIA employee or agent. And he was caught with the burglars in the offices of the committee to re-elect the president in the Watergate facility. That's who they were and where they were caught by the Metropolitan Police before the FBI was called into the case approximately 6 to 8 hours later.
And what was their purpose?
The alleged purpose of them being there was to remove surreptitious listening devices that they had placed in this headquarters in the prior month, which was May. And it turned out, of course, to be a very poor decision for them to do this. They were very amateurish in the way they conducted themselves in a burglary, and the devices which they placed in there, they would have been better off just leaving the devices in there and not even taking them out. They didn't really need to do this.
And the purpose of the listening devices was to obtain campaign strategy and information.
I believe so. It's been the conjecture. I don't know that it was ever really established what they got or what the purpose of what they put the devices in there for, but it would seem obvious that's what this was for, because this is about maybe 5 to 6 months before the election itself. One thing that should be mentioned, another thing I found out in researching the book, and Angelo shared this with me, and I obtained it from another source too, and that is the very night of the burglary, when we got involved in it, when the police had apprehended the subject, an individual identifying himself as John Ehrlichman called the Washington field office of the FBI, spoke to the night supervisor, and told the night supervisor, shut the case down now. Get out of this case. So the night of the burglary, there was a call made by this individual who said he was John Ehrlichman from the White House, ordering the FBI, the Washington field office of the FBI, to shut the case down now and not get involved in investigating this apprehension, this Watergate apprehension. So the actual interference, the actual threat, the actual orders on trying to interfere with the FBI began the night of the burglary apprehension. And, of course, it continued on into that second week when we were confronted by our then director, L. Patrick Gray, who was threatening face-to-face in the Saturday morning massacre everybody from the SAC on down to any agent who had anything to do with this Watergate investigation. So the atmosphere of threat was a continuing aspect of this entire investigation for the agents during the course of the Watergate.
On page 50 of your book, In Pursuit, on the first paragraph, you write, the Watergate saga challenged the FBI's operational credibility, integrity, and reputation. We were threatened by a collection of institutional heavyweights, the dominant political party, and former agents, operatives, and managers of the CIA and FBI, and from within by Gray, meaning L. Patrick Gray.
Correct.
So you are trying to just do an FBI investigation.
Absolutely.
You know, where it goes, who it involves, doesn't matter. You and your squad, under the leadership of Angelo Lano, just want to collect the facts. And you're having all of these people from the very beginning trying to undermine the investigation.
That's absolutely the case. And what that did, I used the word atmosphere, which is kind of a light adjective describing something. It was actually heavier than that, but there was this layer of threat and menace every day over all of us who were involved in this. So you were not only trying to do the investigation, but you're very, very much aware of, in the background, there's this other aspect going on, and you really don't know what the CIA is doing, and you have no idea what these people who are ex this or ex that are doing or who they're working with, and then you have the Cuban nationals involved. So how many of them are out there, and what have they done? And when you actually get into this, you have this kind of potpourri, this really potentially vicious stew going on, and you're kind of on the outside trying to claw your way in. So it's a very, very uncomfortable atmosphere, but at the same time, you're sharing this determination with your fellow agents, and you want to follow through in the best traditions of the FBI, and you're not going to give up. So it was a really kind of a semi-dramatic trip down this kind of dark tunnel is the best way I can describe it. And it was fascinating. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Well, you have several fascinating stories, and I know that Angela Lano gives us the chronological look at the case, but I want to just jump to the chapter in your book, Chapter 4, about the money trail, where you conduct an all-night interview with an important but kind of unknown witness to all of this.
Yeah, it happened this way. We're about 6 weeks into the investigation. It's late July, and one of the agents working on the case with me was Paul Magalinas, and Paul was from the south side of Chicago. He's a native Spanish speaker, very, very talented guy, and very much like Angelo Lano, Paul's an emotional guy. I actually pretty emotional guy myself, and so one afternoon, in fact, very close to 5 o'clock, Paul just kind of casually says to me, "Hey, John, will you give me a hand with an interview?" And I go, "Sure, Paul." So I make a call indicating I'm not going to be home in time, and Paul and I take off in a Buick car about 5:15 or 5:20. And as we're riding out to an undisclosed destination, Paul starts kind of briefing me on the interview that we're going to conduct. And he says, "There's a couple of women we're going to meet at a lounge in the Key Bridge Marriott on the other side of Washington, D.C. there, just across the line on the Virginia side." He said, "We're going to meet him in a lounge." And he said, "One of them indicates that she may have some very critical information for us, but she's very, very hesitant to cooperate. She works for the committee to re-elect the president, and she wants to cooperate, but she's very, very afraid. So we're going to meet with her and her girlfriend, who also works for the committee, and we're going to sit there for a while with them and make small talk in this lounge, and they're going to decide whether or not we kind of pass muster, and they'll share the information with us." So we met these two women in the lounge over there at the Key Ridge Marriott. Actually, it's the only time I ever drank on duty. I had a scotch and soda. And we sat there for a while, made small talk about the day's news and about general things happening. And it didn't go on for 20 minutes. It went on for 45 or 50 minutes. And I thought, well, this is really not going to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, the key individual, who was a rather small woman, Judy Hoback, she decided, okay, she had confidence in us sufficient to be interviewed by us concerning what she knew, but she didn't want it to take place. Paul offered. He said, well, we can rent a room here at the hotel. We can go back to our office. He said, no, I want nothing to do with an FBI office. She said, what I want you to do is to follow me home. I live in Maryland, just across the D.C. line. And she said, I want you to interview me in my home. So we followed this woman, Judy Hoback, out to her home, and she invited us in. And we began the interview a little after 7 o'clock in her living room. And it turned out Judy Hoback was the auditor, was the individual who kept track of all of the money that came in to the committee to reelect the president. She not only kept track of the money, she dispersed the money to whoever she was authorized to give the money to. And she told a fascinating, detailed story to us over the course of about 7 or 8 hours. The interview went to about 3 o'clock in the morning. She actually laid out all of the illegal payments that had been made to different individuals, cash money that had been handed out by the handfuls, thousands of dollars different times, to different individuals to conduct various activities. And she was extremely distressed over this position she had been put in that was illegal to disperse money in this form in a political campaign. So she laid this all out to us, gave us all the detail, all the names, the amounts, and the dates, and Paul and I had all this information. We finished the interview about 3 o'clock. I can remember walking out.
3 a.m.?
3 a.m., yeah. We went from we met in the Keybridge Marriott from about maybe 5:45, 6 o'clock, till about 6:30, 6:40 in the evening where they were checking us out. She and her girlfriend, who was a lady by the name of Peggy Gleason, and they were checking us out. As I mentioned, we had passed the test, and then she said, well, follow me out. So we followed her out. We got there about 7 o'clock. We interviewed her from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., taking notes the whole time. I had this tremendous amount of information, okay? 3 o'clock, Paul and I walk out, and we're both tired, and at the same time, we're elated. It's one of those situations that an agent's in, not infrequently in your career, where you have a break, and yes, you're tired, but you're also kind of on a high because you recognize this is very, very important. So we're deciding, standing there in the kind of the morning heavy, almost tropical heat of the district in July. We're standing there in suburban Maryland, and we're saying, well, what are we going to do? Paul says, well, let's go home, and we'll come back early, and we'll type this out or we'll dictate it. I said, no, we're not going to do that. I said, we're going right back into the office, Paul. I said, I'm a really good typist. I said, we're going to sit down with our notes, and I said, we're going to rough draft this thing, and we're going to get it perfect. I said, and then we're going to turn it into the steno pool, and we're going to go home and get a few hours sleep. So we did that. We finished at about maybe 9:30, 9:45 in the morning, and we got out there. They put it in the steno pool. We came back a few hours later and, checked it out, and it was fine. It turned out it was almost 20 pages. I think it was 19 and a half pages of information that we had in there that really turned the case, kind of solidified the case in the direction that we had been generally heading. But it was the first direct, rather complete information concerning how the funds had been used and how it had been dispersed in cash payments to individuals to do different things, including this burglary. So it was really kind of a breakthrough interview.
Could you tell us a little bit how this interview also helped you connect John Mitchell to the investigation?
Yeah, it put Mitchell really into the mix because the amount of money involved had to be authorized at a very, very high level. So Mitchell was actually the chairman of this particular entity. He was the individual that had left, I think, the Attorney General's position and had come over here to run this committee. And so he was heavily involved. He was the head guy here. Underneath him was an individual named Hugh Sloan. And Hugh Sloan was a real manager of this committee underneath Mitchell. So it dragged both Hugh Sloan in and it dragged Mitchell in. So these were active participants in the running of this particular committee, and Judy was able to talk about their role and how active they were in the day-to-day managing and the operation of this entity. It turned out, of course, Hugh Sloan was a lot more active than Mitchell. Mitchell was a little bit further away, but he was certainly there. So this interview pulled them in and also defined the breadth and the depth of this particular operation.
Now, this interview also indicated to you that there was a leak. You know, you had heard about leaks before, but after interviewing Judy Hoback and getting this information, it ends up in the Washington Post. Oh yeah, it ends up on the front page of the Washington Post. I don't know, 2 or 3 days later. It's almost verbatim, and so it was a very, very upsetting thing to have confirmed that we had this real substantial leak of information. So that I remember, Paul, both of us being very, very upset. Of course, we had no idea at the time what was going on behind the scenes, and when you think about it, this just adds to the feeling of kind of this shadowy menace that was all around you when you were conducting this investigation, because you can't figure out, well, where's this coming from? It's got to be coming from inside the FBI someplace, because this is no, it can't be coming from the FBI because we don't do this. Well, it turns out, yes, we did this. Okay? So here we are, we're sitting on these horns of contradiction. On the one hand, we don't do this, and on the other hand, here it is staring at us from the Washington Post. So, I mean, how as a line-level agent do you begin to reconcile these kind of pulling directions, these pulling forces that are gnawing at you? It was a horrible situation. Did you have any suspicion that the leak was coming from C2, from your squad, from the street agents involved in this investigation?
Not at all. We had the fullest confidence that none of the guys that we worked for, none of the street agents, would be leaking any information. We had that much confidence in each other. We knew each other that well. So there was, but when I thought about it later on, and when I got to know more about what happened in the Watergate case, and when you look at other cases in the political arena where there are leaks, and if you even look at the current administration, you can see the current president, President Trump, is obsessed, absolutely obsessed with leaks. And of course, it turns out in the Watergate case, and I think in other cases too, but certainly in the Watergate case, leaks never come from the bottom. Leaks come from the layers that are upper, middle, and above. Upper, middle, and above. Because think about it. Who is maneuvering for the next promotion? Who's trying to generate, who's trying to build the political force that will get them moved to the next level? It's certainly not a line-level employee like an FBI agent or, say, a police detective. It's going to be somebody much higher up, so leaks are always at a high level. But, of course, the individuals at the top who are working with these seemingly loyal underlings, they never believe it's the people immediately below them, but that's where the leaks are, in my opinion.
That's fascinating. So, in your opinion, leaks are not made in order to share information with the public. It's not somebody feeling this altruistic need to share information with the public, but it's a way of gaining position and maneuvering and manipulating at a whole different level.
I think so. I think that's the primary impetus for the leaks. And when I tried to come to grips in analyzing the material, the information which I had when I was writing the book, I tried, and my toughest chapter was the chapter on Mark Felt. I took a different position from most agents with respect to evaluating Mark Felt. Most agents, and some of the words used by agents to talk about Mark Felt, I think Jack McDermott, our former SAC in Washington Field Office, described Mark Felt as the Benedict Arnold of the FBI. And there were other phrases which were more direct and less complimentary than that, describing Mark Felt. I looked at it a little bit differently. I looked at Felt in a chapter in my book. I looked at him as a little bit, quite a bit more sophisticated and nuanced individual who had multiple reasons for leaking information. I thought one of the reasons that he might have leaked was to provide a degree of cover for the FBI agents working the case, in that if the information does get into the public arena, the public will be so concerned about this breach of integrity by the political apparatus, whoever the political apparatus might be, that they'll support the FBI in the investigation. So it could bring a degree of support through the word getting out through journalistic effort, and that might have been one of the reasons, but also could have been a vindictive reason to kind of get back because he was passed over for the FBI directorship. So there could be multiple reasons.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But of course, we don't find out that the leaks were coming from Mark Felt until years later. So while you're doing this investigation, you still don't know where this information, who is providing this information to the media and why.
No, have no idea. There's a lot of speculation, but actually no idea at all who was doing it. And of course, the information on Felt, I don't think came out until the gentleman was in his 80s, and it actually came out, I think, in 1985 or 1986 when he was residing with his daughter just north of San Francisco in a nice area up toward the wine country called Santa Rosa. And I think at that time he admitted that he was deep throat.
We have a few other stories that I want to get in before we run out of time.
Sure.
Stories, again, that Angelo didn't have the time to share with us. And the story that I need for you to tell us about. It's about doing the search at the White House and interaction between President Nixon and a member of the search team. Can you tell us that story?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd love to tell you that story. I have to tell you that story. It's one of my favorite all-time stories. It's just a great story, okay? Here's the way it goes down. We're well into the case, okay? It's late April of 1973. 9 months has gone by, okay? And it's a Friday afternoon. It's close to 5 o'clock, and it's I think April 23rd. It's the end of April 73. And there are 2 good months in Washington, D.C., April and maybe September, okay? They're great months. The weather is perfect. The blossoms are out. It couldn't be nicer. Washington's a beautiful city. I love it. So it's one of those days. And it's the end of the week, and we're all thinking, we're going to head home. And the supervisor walks in, and he says, freeze the book. Freeze the book, okay? Whenever that happened, I had this vision of a glacier creeping across the sign-out register, okay? It was being frozen. And there's this groan goes up amongst everybody. Oh, no. So here we are, 4:45.
You're going to have to explain that for non-bureau people.
Okay, freeze the book means we had a sign-out register. We actually had a form that we had to sign when we left the office and went off duty. And when we came on duty, we had to sign in on this same register at the time we reported. So the FBI kept very specific track of the time in and the time out on the agents. And so when they said freeze the book, it meant that no one could literally sign out. You had to just wait. You were kind of holding in place until they told you what they wanted you to do. So that was, we couldn't leave the office. We couldn't go home, okay? So that was a freeze the book type thing. And so there we are, we're waiting, and about maybe 10 after 5, 11 after 5, the supervisor says, you, kind of pointing his finger, he says, go down to the SAC's office. And so that was one floor down in the old post office building. So in mass, there's about a dozen of us. We head down to the SAC's office wondering what this is going to be. Mr. Kunkel, our SAC, had been replaced by another SAC named Jack McDermott. Well, Jack McDermott was a very direct New Yorker with a distinct sense of that kind of New York humor. And I love the guy because he was very hands-on, and one of his styles was he liked to kind of bring you into his office, and he'd make a phone call or two, and while he made the phone call, you'd be briefed. You'd hear what was going on. So you were with him when he was making his decisions, and then he would tell you what he wanted you to do as a functionary. So we're around the perimeter of his office, and he's sitting behind his chair, his desk there in his chair, and he's really looking like he's enjoying himself. And he says on the phone, he looks at someone, he says, "Hey, Millie," he says, "get me the head of the Secret Service." So he hangs the receiver up and he waits, and the phone rings, and he picks up the receiver and he says, "Hello, this is Joh McDermott. I'm a special agent in charge of the FBI." And I guess the guy on the other end said he's with the Secret Service. And McDermott says, in effect, are you in charge? Are you the head of the Secret Service? And I guess this guy said that he really wasn't. And McDermott says, "Well, I want to speak to the head of the Secret Service." And this guy says, "Well, he's not the head." And McDermott says, "Well, can you get me the number 2 man?" I guess this guy said, "Well, the number 2 man's not available." Well, it's Friday. Okay, he's probably left. So McDermott then says in a rather frustrating voice, he says, "Well, is anybody there in charge of the Secret Service?" And I guess this guy said, "Well, I guess I am then. Maybe I'm the number 3 or 4 man, but I guess I'm in charge." Okay. So McDermott then says, "Okay." He said, "Well," he starts all over again. He says, "I'm Joh McDermott. I'm the special agent in charge of the Washington Field office of the FBI. On order of the Attorney General, there will be about a dozen special agents of the FBI walking up Pennsylvania Avenue to the west wing of the White House. They will enter, they will take control of all business offices of the President, including the President's personal office. No paper, nothing will be allowed in or out of any of those offices till the order is given."
Your mouth must have hung open when you're listening to this. You're going to search the White House.
We're going to go into whatever the business offices are, okay? We're going to go into these business offices, and we are going to seal them off. We're going to let nobody in or out, including the President, okay? And we're going to let no paper in or out until we are given orders to the contrary. That's what he's telling the Secret Service, and that's what he's telling us. And he said, this is on order. He was quite specific. He started the sentence with, "on order of the Attorney General." Okay, so it was unambiguous where this came from. He's telling us, he's telling the Secret Service. Well, the next thing we hear out of McDermott is his voice is rising, and he says, no, FBI agents will not be surrendering their guns to the Secret Service. And I guess the guy on the other end says, well, they will. And McDermott comes back and says, no, I am telling you, FBI agents are always armed. They will be entering the west wing of the White House. And he goes through the whole thing again. And then he takes the receiver and he says in the receiver, he says, "Goodbye." And he slams the receiver down. And then he kind of leans back and he's kind of smiling now. And he's looking around. He's rotating his chair and he's making eye contact with each one of us, about a dozen of us. And he goes, "Any questions, gentlemen?" Just like that. And of course, in the FBI, there's never any questions because that's why they hired you. Okay, you either know what to do or you can figure it out. They didn't hire you to answer questions that you have. So nobody has any questions, and we walk out of there in total silence. Okay, total silence. We go down Pennsylvania Avenue. Like I said, it's a beautiful day. And everybody's running in different directions to get to buses, cars, carpools. They want to get out of the district, go home to wherever that is, okay? And here we are, once again. We're either marching down to headquarters or we're going the other way. Now we're marching up toward the White House. And we get to 13th Street. We're going across the first street, that we're crossing on the way to the White House, up around 15th or 16th up there. And this voice comes from my left. It's the first anybody said of anything. And this voice goes, "Hey, Min," my last name, Mindermann. "Hey, Min, do you think they'll shoot?" Like that, okay? And I think the question came to me. We didn't have an anointed head of whatever was happening here. But I think the question came to me because I was a firearms instructor, and I was also the guy, the head of the SWAT team, okay, by that time. And so the question comes to me, do I think the Secret Service is going to shoot? And I go, no. I said, no way. I said, I've had a lot of contact with the Secret Service, 2 times. I had a lot of contact with the Secret Service. I said, they're professional like us. I said, they're going to be real easy to deal with. We just have to make sure we identify who we are. And so when we get to the West Wing of the White House, here's the...
Wait a minute, though.
Yeah.
Did you really believe that?
I didn't know. In point of fact, I had no idea what was going to happen, and none of us did. We had no idea what was going to occur. I was hoping that would be the case because what I knew from my prior experience with the police is once one shot is fired, all the guns go off. Okay? I knew that when you just don't ever have one shot when you've got a group of people with guns. Everybody shoots. Okay. So I was very, very afraid, and I was extremely concerned that there might be what I would call kind of an errant, nervous shot. But I thought, well, hopefully that's not going to happen. But I knew I had to put out the idea that this was not going to happen so that our group had confidence that when we walked in there, this was not going to happen. I didn't want anybody nervous. I didn't want anybody thinking gun, shot, anything. So I said, no, it's not going to happen. No, I know these guys. They're just like us. They know what they're doing. They're well-trained. They're devoted. They're good, So I put that out there, and I had hoped that would help, but I didn't really know. None of us knew. But we knew what we had to do. So we went up there, and it was really kind of a comical scene because here's a dozen FBI agents with these little tiny credentials with the really impressive FBI and blue on them, that you wave around all the time. And we're waving these credentials around, yelling, FBI, FBI, and we're hoping nothing happens. Yeah. And here we are walking in, and these guys are waiting for us, and they're looking very, very glum. But it actually turned out really quite well. The interaction with the Secret Service was very professional. They were helpful. They guided us to the offices we needed to go to. We were able to do our job. And we held in there for the weekend. And I don't know how long this went on because I only did it for a short period of time, relatively short period of time. But there was an incident you mentioned, what I found out later on was Monday, President Nixon, he was away for the weekend. He was at Camp David, and he was rapidly disintegrating mentally. He was vacillating between these highs and these lows emotionally, and everything was coming apart at the seams for him during this period of time. He comes back Monday, and of course, here are these FBI agents cordoning off his offices, and he's pacing around with his entourage, and he's saying, this is terrible, here's the FBI occupying my White House, and back and forth he's going. And finally, about 7:30, 8 o'clock Monday, he, by himself, confronted one of our agents, and according to the story that I heard, actually grabbed the agent by the lapels, by his business jacket, by his coat, and kind of lifted the agent off the ground and kind of rocked him and slammed him gently against the wall there. And so I put in the book, what do you do if you're mugged by the President of the United States? And, of course, the answer is not much. You don't do anything, okay? And so the agent handled it very, very coolly, as you would expect him to. And the very interesting thing for me was the way the incident ended was about an hour and a half later, maybe 2 hours later, President Nixon returned to that agent who was still on duty and apologized to the agent for his behavior. So we had a relatively uneventful occupation up there at the White House.
Wow, that's a fascinating story. Again, one that I don't think I've ever heard of before. So we've been talking for a while, and I do still have lots of other questions, but for a chronological, detailed look at this case and everything that happened, everyone should go and listen to episode 63. We're just getting some highlights, some color commentary here. But I do want to talk about the resolution, the results of this, and your feelings about the case and how it ended and how that may have affected the rest of your career. Can we do that?
Sure. For me, in kind of looking at the broad parameters of the case, it had a major impact on the American political scene. And, of course, you can't divorce that. That's an integral part of American history. So it's by far the most historic case that I've ever had a hand in. And I think it is a symbol, really, of both the strength and perhaps the weaknesses in our system. The strength comes from, of course, the degree of resolution and the degree of finality that was achieved in the case. And I would say that we successfully investigated this case, but I always felt that we really hadn't tied together or identified everything that happened in the matter. My sense of the case from the get-go and to this day is that the heavy, obvious involvement of the CIA in the burglary itself and in the presence of E. Howard Hunt. Now, you have to remember, E. Howard Hunt is an individual, or was an individual, was identified as a case manager for the CIA. He apparently was in command of the forces that left Miami to stage the Bay of Pigs invasion. E. Howard Hunt was an individual who had written under pseudonyms spy novels. E. Howard Hunt was an individual who lived in a beautiful home in the Potomac area of Maryland, just outside D.C. E. Howard Hunt was an individual who inexplicably left underneath, as Angelo identified in his interview with you, who left underneath a paper covering in a dresser drawer in one of the rooms that was searched by the FBI and the police in the Watergate case. He left there a check in an envelope with his name and address on the check and on the envelope. So he put himself at the scene and admitted that that was his check and his envelope. E. Howard Hunt is an individual who never made a statement, or to my knowledge was never interviewed in depth, put before a grand jury, before the Senate committee, to talk about what the CIA role might have been in this case. So, to me, I would have liked to seen more resolution, more effort directed toward perhaps that aspect of the case. What we were able to do, I thought, was excellent, but I would have liked to felt that we were more complete in actually running everything out that possibly was there.
Is there a particular reason that did not happen?
I believe there was. I think at the time there was far too much presumption on the part of the FBI, and behind the FBI, I think the political establishment, including Congress and perhaps even the American people in general, but I think there was far too much acceptance of this idea that anything the CIA did would not be subject to deep scrutiny because they were working under this super secret mantle that prevented scrutiny and prevented in-depth probing if it came to an actual adversarial process. And I think when you take an agency and you completely remove them from adversarial scrutiny, you give them an impetus. You give them kind of a godlike, self-assured quality which enables them perhaps to do things that they did in the Watergate case. And I think that's a very, very dangerous position to put our republic in. So I think we missed a chance if the chance was there, and I think it was. And I think we should have gone down a road of much more heavy advocacy to probe the CIA.
Now, there's going to be some people who listen to what you just said and relate it to today and the scrutiny and the request for information that the FBI is undergoing now.
Well, there's an article that just came out. I think it's the May 14th issue of Time magazine, and on the cover is an FBI gold badge. And
I've seen it. I've read it.
You've seen it. You've read it. I've read about maybe a little over half the article, and I've looked at that cover. The cover itself, to an FBI agent, is as shattering as the image that you're looking at. So it's a very unquieting feeling you get when you look at that cover. I read about half the article, and the article seemed to me, the half that I read, the article seemed to be rather balanced and rather well written and not a hit piece. So that raised some concerns, and what really, really raised my concern was the statement that Andrew McCabe apparently lied to two FBI agents from the Internal Affairs Branch of the FBI in answering a question concerning what he did in some actions that he was being probed about. And that was very, very disquieting to me and very unsettling, because that goes to the very heart and soul of our integrity. So if we're having any problems there, especially at our high-level executive ranks, then we do have some problems that need to be addressed. And I also would say that those problems, whatever they are, if they go to the issues of integrity, honesty, and ethics, these problems need to be made public, whether they're the FBI, the CIA, or a local police department. They need to be public, and they need to be thoroughly aired, and they need to be corrected. To me, that's the healthy approach.
Now, the article that you were talking about, again, was from Time magazine. The title of the article is "The FBI is in Crisis. It's Worse Than You Think." And I have written about this on social media, indicating that reading the article was both frustrating and it saddened me. And although I didn't agree with everything the article said, it did cause me to ask, what have they done to my FBI, as far as the leadership. So, I agree with you that we're not afraid for people to look at issues and problems, because if there are any that occur in the institution, then those need to be corrected. But talking about articles, there's another article that you sent me that I also wanted to mention, so that anyone listening to this episode may also be interested in that. And it was an article that was in the New York Times titled, and I wish it wasn't titled this because it makes it sound political, and I don't believe the article was a political look at the FBI, but it's titled "How Donald Trump Misunderstood the FBI." And the subtitle is, "Since Watergate, the Bureau has come to view itself as an essential and essentially independent check on the president." And it goes through a number of presidents and their almost adversarial relationship with the FBI, and you are prominently quoted.
Oh, I think that was the article by Tim Weiner an article he did in the pictorial section, or rather the magazine section of the New York Times, July 2nd, I think, of last year. He called me and he wanted to do an interview, and we actually did about an hour and a half interview and it resulted in that article in which I was prominently quoted. It was kind of interesting in that particular interview. The interview went very well, I thought, and he called me the following day, and he said, "John, that was a great interview." Like he was kind of surprised. And one of the things that it pointed out to me, Jerry, is one of the things in my view which has always, and I mean this in a very positive way, has always kind of sold the FBI short, is agents in general are so circumspect, are so reluctant to share and talk about what they know and what they've done. And you know from the work that you've done, far more than the contacts I've had, there are phenomenal stories out there of what FBI agents have done to protect and enhance our republic, defend our republic. And those stories don't get out there. So both the agents and the Bureau itself is grossly underserved by the reluctance and I will say the failure of our agents to tell their stories. So I'm answering Weiner's questions, and I'm telling him what I know and maybe what I believe to a certain extent. And he comes back and he says, "John, that was a great interview." And I'm thinking to myself, how sad that a prominent journalist comes back and tells me, "Oh, that was a great interview." Like, I don't have many of those, okay? And that told me more than I wanted to know, Jerry.
I agree with you because, in doing this project, I have been able to talk to some fantastic agents about their fantastic cases, but I also have been turned down or gotten no response from agents on cases that I would love to cover. And, I think it's a training because one thing that listeners don't understand is that in the Bureau, you're a case agent and you live and die for your cases. You work so hard, but at the end, when the successes are announced, it's by the SAC and by the U.S. Attorney, and that agent may not even be in the room and sometimes not get any type of recognition or pat on the back. And I know you know about that because you didn't get any recognition or pat on the back for the work that you guys did on Watergate. And so I think agents get trained not to talk about those cases, not to talk about those successes, to just say, "Oh, well, I did that," and move on. And what I'm trying to do is to get as many agents as possible to share their stories. Not a simple write-up, and I don't want to criticize the Bureau, but not a simple write-up at FBI website that gives you a bland overview of the cases, but a real, genuine look at what it takes to work these cases and how hard we work on them.
Okay. You mentioned that you don't want to criticize the Bureau, and I feel exactly the same way. But I'm going to come off that for just a little bit. I'm going to be dead, forthright, honest here, okay? I have said to a few agents and some other people, I've used rather strong language, and not profane language, but here's what I've said about the FBI and Watergate. I've said, the Bureau did a lousy job of telling the story of the Watergate to the public. It's a marvelous story of what the FBI accomplished under the most difficult circumstances. It's an institutional story, and it's a terrific story of many, many agents. And let me just share a quick one with you that I didn't even know about until I had extensive conversations during this past year with my partner, Paul Magalinas, in the interview we did with Judy Hoback on the Money Trail, that great interview that we were privileged to do. Paul says to me, he said, John, he said, I went down to the D.C. jail, and he said, I interviewed the Cubans in Spanish. I said, you did? I didn't know about that, Paul. He goes, yeah. I went down there, and I interviewed them in the D.C. jail. And he says, the Cubans told me, hey, we work for the same man. There's no problem. We work for the same man. So these poor Cubans, it appears, from what they told Paul in making this statement, we work for the same man, they're talking about Richard Nixon. These Cubans thought they were doing patriotic duty as they committed these burglaries under the auspices, apparently, of the CIA. So these poor guys are working for the CIA, they think, and they're not working for the CIA at all. So if you really come back and you begin exploring some of the things that occurred, and they keep popping up in this case, you realize how deep and how threatening this case actually was, how people were deluded, how they were misled. And that's what we were dealing with here, and it was at all levels. And here in the middle of this are these poor grade 12 and grade 13 FBI agents working on the Miscellaneous Crimes Squad at WFO. I mean, guys with 2-3 years experience like me.
And I'm correct, right, that you never received anything, any type of commendation or recognition for the work?
Never. Not a single thing. Not even a, hey, thank you. But honestly, in my experience, that wasn't unusual. That was not unusual. I actually had a situation when I worked as a police officer in San Francisco where I was involved in an extremely difficult, threatening case involving a multiple shooting, and I could go on at length about what it was, and I was put in for an award. And when it came up before a board of very, very senior police officials to review it, the level of the award was dumbed down to the next level down because one of the officials read what happened and said, well, there's no way all of this could have happened. So the implication was that my partner and I had kind of convoluted to add some things that would kind of heighten the danger here, that this stuff really couldn't have happened. Well, in point of fact, it all happened the way it was written, but it was so far out they couldn't believe it. But these are the kinds of things I think that maybe happen in our work in the FBI, where these things are experienced by agents in offices all over the United States and probably in foreign countries, and nobody ever hears about it.
And that's sad.
It is very, very sad, and that's where we undersell ourselves. And I think agents are so used to being told that they don't talk about anything. They also, I think, get a little bit, and this is hard to imagine with an FBI agent, but I think you get a little bit beaten down after a while. And also, you get in a retired status and you get older, you perhaps become a little bit more reticent, a little bit more reluctant to step out there than perhaps when you were younger. So I think there's a combination of things that kind of work against you here.
I agree with you. I mean, especially in society today where there are people who are ready to criticize, ready to hate. You know, I put myself out there and I try to do it in a way where I'm staying positive and, you know, providing good information, but facts. Yeah, so you can make your own decisions and your own judgments. But it is difficult, and I respect those agents who turn me down and don't return my email and my telephone calls. But this is a time I truly believe that the FBI has got to tell their story, not let other people tell the story, but we need to tell our story. And there's a lot of us out there, a lot of names I could drop of people who are doing that, and yours would be one of them. You know, the fact that you took the time to write this book, again, in pursuit from the streets of San Francisco to Watergate, to make sure that the FBI story of Watergate is told.
Well, you know, I very much appreciate you making that observation. It just makes me feel that the effort was worthwhile and that I was actually on the right track by trying to do this, because I didn't arrive at the decision to try and do the book in a casual way at all. I really, really second-guessed myself and said, you know, should I be doing this? My gosh, I wasn't even the case agent. I was just one of the guys involved. But, oh, yeah, I was one of the guys involved in one of the key interviews and some other things that happened. And I thought to myself, well, it came down to if nobody else is going to do it, I need to try. So that was the basis on which I went forward.
Now, I know you told me, and we had another conversation before we started recording, that you did talked to Angelo Lano, the case agent, and that he actually gave you permission and gave you information to share in your book.
He did, and it was really, really terrific. And I'll share with you that Angelo was a personality, was a character I was not particularly close with on the squad. Okay, I was on the squad for 5 years, but kind of Angelo did his work, I did mine, we interacted and so forth, but we were not close in a partnership relationship or anything like that. And Angelo's kind of a strong, independent character, so I was actually a bit reluctant and hesitant to contact him, and, well, I knew I had to. So finally I made a call, and Angelo answered the phone, and I said, "Hey, Angelo, you remember John Mindermann?" "Oh, yeah, John." I said, "Well, here's what I'm doing." And I thought, oh, my gosh, I wonder if Angelo is going to give me a hand, or maybe he'll think it isn't the thing to do. So Angelo said, well, he says, "I'm on the cell," and he says, I'm en route to Rehoboth Beach for the weekend. He says, "I'll send you something, okay?" And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. So I kind of wondered what was going to happen after that, and I waited. And about 3 weeks later, in an envelope, in an 8.5 by 11.5 manila envelope, came 7 single-spaced pages, computer-generated pages, of observations that he had made of things that had happened to him and what he faced in the case, and it was a wonderful addition to what I had, and very much a key to going forward. So that was a real pleasant experience that I had dealing with Angelo and the level of cooperation that he gave me.
And that must have really felt good.
It did.
And I know he's done only a few interviews, so I'm absolutely honored that he did episode 63 with me. But he basically was saying, "John, I am so glad that you're going to tell that story for us."
Yeah, we gave it a shot, and there is some material out there now. And thanks to your interview and your effort, Jerry, with Angelo and with others, the public can get some, I think, real feel for what their agents, and we are agents of the American people, what their agents did to really try and protect the Republic and ensure the integrity of the United States. And on this earth, I don't think there's a higher calling.
And I would hope also that it will give them a measure of trust as to what's going on now, that the street agents, those agents that are investigating Russian interference and matters that are before the public now, that they're going to do that investigation with integrity and independence. Independence,
integrity, determination, and the will to prevail under the most difficult circumstances. These are the things that FBI agents do routinely, and I'm sure those kinds of qualities are in place right now. I'm hoping that they are. I believe that they are, because they're critically important to the mission of the FBI and what we need to do. So that's kind of, I think, where we really are. And one thing I think that is really, really detrimental to the FBI and to all law enforcement is this unrelenting drumbeat of criticism heaped upon the FBI specifically, and in other areas of our national intelligence services and law enforcement. It's just not positive. I have the fullest confidence in the FBI. I don't believe the FBI is going to be beaten down or the FBI is going to be taken apart or anything drastic is going to happen. I think the strength and integrity is there despite maybe some disappointments and some backsteps that have occurred. I don't think it's going to be major, but it's going to have to be corrected, and that'll be a good thing for everybody.
Well, I am going to make sure that in this episode's show notes on jerrywilliams.com that I have a direct link to your book, In Pursuit, From the Streets of San Francisco to Watergate. I'm also going to have a link to both articles that we talked about, the one that was in the Time magazine that talked about the state of the FBI today, and the New York Times magazine article that goes through the history of the FBI's relationship with many presidents in the midst of investigations that were conducted. But one of the things I like to do at the end of all of my interviews is to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, Watergate was a real privilege to work, and it brought me very, very close to a lot of FBI agents and to a lot of people. Judy Holbach, the key witness in particular. And one thing I should mention is that Paul Magalinas and I recently met with Judy at her home base in Florida there, and we had a kind of get-together after 38 years had gone by since the original interview, and it was very, very reassuring to Paul and I that she still felt very strongly about the key role that she played in effect, breaking the Watergate case. She was very adamant about the illegal, unethical things that were being done that she was being forced to do. It still was with her 38 years later. So I think that speaks to a very strong kind of ethical and moral basis for American citizens in general, and I think it should be an inspiration for anybody out there, FBI agent, Secret Service agent, local law enforcement officer, who's doing investigative work, to know that there are citizens out there who will cooperate and do want to do the right thing and have strong values to support our country. So that's kind of my takeaway from my experience in the FBI, is how great the American public is in generally supporting our efforts and wanting to do the right thing. And what a great organization, and the people I work with in always attempting to do the right thing, the moral thing, the ethical thing, the legal thing, to help our country and to safeguard the public. So we have a great deal to be thankful for, and we have a great deal to be proud of, and I think that remains in place today.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of John Mindermann. You'll find an FBI review of the Watergate investigation, as well as a timeline from CNN. And you'll see those articles about the perception of the FBI today from Time Magazine and the New York Times. And there is a direct link to John Mindermann's book, In Pursuit, From the Streets of San Francisco to Watergate. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. And please don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app. I would love to hear your thoughts about this episode and your perceptions of the FBI. You can post your comment in this episode's show notes at jerrywilliams.com. Now, I hope you'll stick around for just a few more minutes so that I can tell you about my new book, Greedy Givers, which will be released on June 28th as an ebook and as a trade paperback. Now, in next week's podcast, episode 122, I think last week I said it was episode 123. My numbering was off, but in episode 122, I'm going to be interviewed by my podcasting buddy, Dina Marie from Twisted Philly Podcast, about the case that inspired Greedy Givers. If I say so myself, it's a fascinating case review, and so I hope you'll listen to that. Greedy Givers is the second book in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, but my advanced readers tell me that you can follow Greedy Givers even if you haven't read Pay to Play. I want to thank you for your support. Let me tell you Greedy Giver's premise. She believes he's a con man. He believes he's a victim of what happens when greed and giving collide. Special Agent Carrie Wheeler refuses to accept the hero label, even after receiving the FBI and the City of Philadelphia's Medal of Bravery. She just wants to get back to work. Her new case has her investigating Cuthbert Cuddy Mullins, a self-described do-gooder who says he is changing the world for the glory of God. He's accused of running the largest charity Ponzi scheme in the country, as he attempts to convince everyone, wealthy philanthropists, donors, nonprofits, and even himself, that it's all a big misunderstanding. Carrie knows that she and Cuddy have something in common. They are both living a lie. He claims God gave him the gift to read troubled souls. Will he be able to read hers? Greedy Givers. Pick up a copy on June 28th. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.